For Abel, solitude wasn't a choice, it was a sentence. For 15 years, his small ranch at the edge of the territories had been his prison, his monastery, and his purgatory. He worked from sunup to sundown, the sweat and exhaustion a welcome distraction from a silence that was always listening, always haunted by the ghost of a memory he could never outrun. His life was a long, unbroken penance for a sin committed in another lifetime, a sin whose face he saw every time he closed his eyes. One late afternoon, the silence was broken, not by the cry of a hawk or the rustle of the wind, but by the sharp, desperate snap of a twig in his vegetable garden. Abel froze. His world was one of carefully constructed isolation. Any intrusion was a threat. With the heavy, familiar weight of his rifle in his hands, he moved silently towards the sound, his face a grim mask of hardened weariness. There, huddled between the rows of winter squash, were two skeletal figures. They were girls, barely women, their tattered dresses hanging off their thin frames. Their faces were smudged with dirt and fear, their eyes wide with the terror of cornered animals. One of them was desperately pulling raw carrots from the earth, stuffing them into a sack with trembling hands. Abel raised his rifle, the sharp click of the hammer echoing in the quiet air. "That doesn't belong to you." The two girls gasped, spinning around. The taller one, Clara, immediately pushed her sister, Rose, behind her, shielding her with her own frail body. They stared at Abel, at the unyielding barrel of his rifle, and their faces crumpled with a despair that went beyond the fear of being caught stealing. It was the despair of those who had reached the absolute end of their line. Abel took a step forward, his expression hard. But before he could utter another word, Clara did something he never expected.
I took it off.
With a frantic, desperate gesture, she ripped a tarnished silver locket from around her neck. The chain snapped, but she didn't seem to notice. She held it out to him, her hand trembling violently. "I took it off, please," she cried. "Look, please, just look. See his face. We are not thieves. We are his daughters." Abel stared at the locket, annoyed. He thought it was a trick, some worthless trinket meant to distract him. Reluctantly, he lowered his rifle slightly and took the small, silver oval, still warm from her skin. He clicked it open, and the world stopped. The sharp crack of rifles 15 years ago, the smell of gunpowder and pine on a cold morning, a man's surprised eyes as he fell from his horse. The face in the locket was older, kinder, but it was unmistakably the same. Thomas. The ghost he had tried to bury for 15 years was staring up at him from the palm of his hand, and the man's starving children were standing right in front of him, begging for mercy. A strangled gasp escaped Abel's lips. He stumbled back as if struck, the locket falling from his nerveless fingers. The rifle felt impossibly heavy, a tool of damnation in his hands. The anger, the suspicion, it all evaporated, replaced by a wave of cold, soul-shattering horror. He was not looking at two thieves. He was looking at the living consequences of his greatest sin. He couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. The girls watched, their fear turning to bewilderment at the sight of this hard man suddenly broken before them. After a long, agonizing moment, he made his move. It was not to raise the rifle. It was not to shout. With a choked, silent gesture, he simply pointed towards his cabin. An invitation, a plea, the first, desperate act in a penance he now knew was only just beginning. The short walk from the garden to the cabin felt like a mile. Clara and Rose moved with the cautious steps of wild fawns entering a wolf's den, their eyes darting around, expecting a trap at any moment. Abel followed behind, the rifle now pointed at the ground, its weight a crushing reminder of his guilt. He didn't usher them in. He simply opened the door to his Spartan home and stepped aside, unable to meet their gaze. The interior was clean but utterly devoid of comfort: a cot, a table, 2 chairs, and a cold stone hearth. It was the home of a man who did not live but merely existed. Clara pushed her sister inside first, her hand never leaving Rose's arm. She picked up the locket from the ground where Abel had dropped it and clutched it tightly in her fist, her only link to a past this man had just shattered. What followed was a strange, silent ritual of penance. Abel moved with a frantic, almost manic energy that both confused and frightened the sisters. He didn't speak a word. He threw wood into the hearth with a clatter, striking a match with trembling hands until a fire roared to life, chasing the chill from the room. He slammed a heavy iron pot onto the stove, filling it with water and hacking chunks of dried meat and vegetables into it with a jerky, desperate haste. He was not offering them charity. He was performing an exorcism, trying to banish the ghost of their father with the clatter of pots and the heat of the fire. The sisters huddled in a corner, watching him, flinching at every sudden movement. They were too exhausted to run, too hungry to refuse what was coming. They saw not a host, but a man wrestling with a powerful, unseen demon. When the stew was ready, he ladled it into 2 bowls, his hands shaking so badly that some of it sloshed onto the table. He placed the bowls on the rough wooden surface, along with 2 spoons and a thick slice of bread, then immediately retreated to the far side of the room, turning his back to them as if he couldn't bear to watch them eat. Clara hesitated for a moment. Then, driven by a hunger that gnawed at her insides, she guided Rose to the table. They ate ravenously, silently, like wolves who hadn't seen a kill in weeks. They didn't taste the food. They simply consumed it, their eyes never leaving the back of the strange, tormented man across the room. They had expected anger, perhaps violence, but this obsessive, silent care was something else entirely. It was unnerving. From his corner, Abel listened to the scrape of their spoons against the bowls. He did not turn. He could not. To look at them to see their father's eyes, their father's bone structure, their father's legacy in their starving faces was a torment beyond endurance. Each spoonful they took felt like a hot coal being pressed against his soul. The narrator's voice becomes deeper, more introspective, revealing Abel's thoughts. He knew this wasn't kindness. It was a desperate, selfish act. He wasn't feeding them to save them. He was feeding them to silence the screaming ghost in his own mind. He believed this was his judgment day, a divine and terrible opportunity to atone. He would give them everything he had: his food, his shelter, his very life, if he had to, not out of pity for them, but out of a profound and unending hatred for himself. When they had finished, he gestured towards his own cot, the only bed in the cabin. He then took a coarse horse blanket, walked to the barn, and did not return, leaving them alone in the suffocating silence of his home, a home now haunted by 3 ghosts instead of 1. The first morning brought with it a cold, uncertain light. Clara and Rose woke to the smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee, and the sound of an axe splitting wood outside. The frantic energy of the previous night was gone, replaced by the steady, monotonous rhythm of work. On the table, Abel had left a loaf of bread, a jar of preserves, and a pitcher of fresh milk before retreating to his self-imposed exile in the barn. He had left them food, but more importantly, he had left them alone. This became their new reality, a life governed by unspoken rules and vast oceans of silence. Abel would rise before dawn, perform his chores, and leave sustenance for them before disappearing to the furthest corners of his ranch. The sisters, in turn, would eat, and then, driven by a lifetime of hardship and a deep-seated need to be useful, they began to tend to the cabin. They swept the dusty floors, washed the few dishes, and mended their own tattered clothes with a needle and thread they found in a small sewing box. They were not repaying a debt. They were trying to carve out a small, safe space in this strange, sad man's world. Days bled into weeks. The sisters' initial, paralyzing fear of Abel began to recede, replaced by a profound and cautious curiosity. They learned the rhythm of his grief. They saw him from a distance, working with a punishing intensity, as if he were at war with the land itself. But they also saw the moments when he would stop, leaning on his axe or his shovel, and stare for an endless time at a large, unplowed field at the western edge of his property. It was a patch of good, fertile earth, yet it lay fallow, overgrown with weeds, a scar on an otherwise well-tended ranch. His shoulders would slump, and a look of such profound, crushing sadness would cross his face that even from afar, they could feel the weight of it. They began to see that his torment was as great, if not greater, than their own poverty. He was not a monster. He was a man haunted by a ghost they could not see, but whose presence they felt in every corner of the silent cabin. One afternoon, while exploring the main room, Rose's fingers brushed against a small, dust-covered wooden box on a high shelf. Curious, she lifted it down. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was a small music box, its lid inlaid with a faded painting of a bluebird. She wound the small key, but it only produced a sad, discordant clunking sound. It was broken. When Abel returned that evening, he saw the music box on the table. He froze, his face paling. He didn't speak, but the sisters saw a flicker of raw, unguarded pain in his eyes. He gently took the box, ran a callous thumb over the painted bird, and placed it back on the high shelf, burying it once more in the dust and shadows. In that single, silent gesture, they understood. This cabin had not always been a place of sadness. It had once held music. It had once held a life that was now gone. They didn't know his story, but they recognized his loss. It was a language of grief they both understood perfectly. The dynamic began to shift. The silence between them was no longer just a barrier of guilt and fear. It became a shared space, a quiet acknowledgement of their mutual sorrow. Clara, seeing his worn-out work gloves, took it upon herself to meticulously stitch the seams, leaving them repaired on the table for him in the morning. Rose, who had a gentle touch, began to tend to the small herb garden near the cabin door, a patch of green that had been neglected for years. Abel, in turn, noticed these small acts. He began leaving them not just food, but other things: 2 bars of lye soap, a bolt of simple calico fabric he had bought in town years ago, a comb. One day, he left 2 pairs of sturdy, well-made leather boots on the porch, their size impossibly correct. He was providing for them, not as a jailer, but as a guardian, a silent protector. He was trying to give them the life their father would have wanted for them, a pathetic but sincere attempt to repay an unpayable debt. And so, the 3 of them, the remorseful killer and the 2 orphaned daughters of the man he had slain, settled into a fragile, impossible routine. They were 3 lonely, shipwrecked souls who had washed ashore on the same desolate island, finding a strange, unspoken comfort in the simple, shared act of surviving another day. The ghost of Thomas was still there, a constant presence in the quiet spaces between them. But now, he was not the only one. The ghosts of their collective past had begun to find company in one another. The fragile peace of their silent cohabitation was a temporary truce, not a permanent treaty. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, the reality of their situation remained an unspoken weight in the air. They were 3 strangers bound by a secret none of them fully understood, living in a house built on a foundation of profound sorrow. And like any structure built on an unstable ground, it was destined to be shaken. The first tremor came with the winter chill. Rose, always the more delicate of the 2 sisters, began to cough. At first, it was a small, dry thing, but within days, it deepened into a harsh, rattling sound that echoed the sicknesses that so often swept through the frontier. A fever took hold, leaving her weak and shivering on the cot, her face flushed with a dangerous heat. For Clara, the sound of that cough was a terrifying echo from the past. It was a sickness like the one that had taken their mother years ago, a slow, relentless fading that had left them orphans. Panic gnawed at her, but she did what she always did. She became the fierce protector, tending to her sister with cool cloths and weak broth, her own fear hidden behind a mask of stoic determination. But this time, she was not alone. Abel, seeing the fever in Rose's eyes, was thrown into a state of desperate, paternal fervor that shattered his carefully constructed wall of detachment. The ghost he had been running from suddenly had a new, terrifyingly real face. He could not, would not, let another child of Thomas die under his watch. The thought was a physical blow, a judgment so severe it spurred him into immediate, frantic action. He burst into the cabin, his usual silence broken. He barked orders at Clara, his voice rough but devoid of anger, filled only with a raw, desperate urgency. He directed her to keep the fire blazing, to boil water, to find every spare blanket in the house. He himself rode his horse into a lather, a 2-day journey to the nearest settlement. returning not with a doctor he knew would refuse him, but with a sack full of expensive medicines, bitter herbs, and quinine remedies he had paid for with the last of his savings.
Just a little more.
He and Clara became a team, united in their singular, desperate goal. He would sit for hours, patiently forcing spoonfuls of bitter medicine and water between Rose's cracked lips. Clara, watching him, was stunned. This was not the act of a man paying a debt. This was the fierce, desperate love of a father fighting for his child. His hands, usually so calloused and rough, were impossibly gentle as he adjusted the blankets around Rose's frail shoulders. His gruffness had vanished, replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability. On the third night, the fever reached its peak. Rose tossed and turned, lost in a delirious dream. She began to murmur, her voice a weak, childish whisper. "Papa, Papa, I'm cold. Where are you, Papa?" Hearing the name, a fresh wave of agony washed over Abel. He knelt by the cot, his large frame trembling.
So sorry.
He looked at Rose's feverish face, so much like her father's, and the guilt of 15 years finally broke through his control. Believing he was alone in the dim candlelight as Clara rested in a chair nearby, he reached out a trembling hand and smoothed the hair from Rose's forehead. A choked, broken whisper escaped his lips, a confession meant only for the ghosts in the room. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Thomas." From the shadows of her chair, Clara's eyes snapped open. She hadn't been asleep. She had heard it, the name. Her father's name, spoken with such intimate, agonizing familiarity by this stranger. A cold dread, sharper and more terrifying than any fear she had ever known, coiled in her stomach. How did this lonely, tormented rancher, in the middle of nowhere, know her father's name? In that moment, the fragile pieces of their strange life shattered, and a new, terrible suspicion began to take root in the ruins. Rose's recovery brought a fragile relief to the small cabin, but it could not mend the fracture that had appeared in the silence between them. The name Thomas hung in the air, unspoken, a ghost more real and terrifying than any they had known before. Clara watched Abel with new eyes sharpened by suspicion. Every act of kindness, every gentle gesture that had once soothed her fear, now seemed sinister,
but
tainted by a secret she could not yet name.
She saw the way he avoided her gaze.
She saw the way he avoided her
gaze,
the way his hands would clench when he thought she wasn't looking. She saw that his sadness was not just grief, it was guilt. He was a man carrying a burden so heavy it had bent his soul, and she now suspected that burden was her own past. The question burned within her, a constant, agonizing fire. How did he know her father's name? She waited until Rose was strong enough to sit up on her own, until the immediate crisis had passed. Then, one gray afternoon, she cornered him. He was standing by the unplowed field, his usual place of penance, staring into the overgrown weeds. She walked up behind him, her footsteps quiet but deliberate. He didn't turn, but she saw his shoulders tense. He knew this was coming. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the wind with the sharpness of glass. "You know my father's name." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation.
I heard
Abel
you.
flinched as if struck.
When Rose was
He
sick,
remained silent, his back
you said
still
his
to her,
name.
a statue of
Tell me.
denial. "I heard you. When Rose was sick, you said his name. You said you were sorry. Sorry for what? Tell me." Abel finally turned, and the face he showed her was that of a man already condemned. The years of guilt had stripped him of any defense. His eyes were hollow, filled with a self-loathing so profound it made Clara take an involuntary step back. He looked at her, at this fierce, fragile girl who wore her father's eyes, and he knew the time for lies was over. The time for penance had truly begun. He didn't try to soften the blow. He didn't make excuses. He simply told her the truth, the words tumbling out in a raw, broken torrent, as if they had been poisoning him from the inside for 15 long years. There was a horse thief. That's what they told us. A man named Thomas. The posse. I was young, foolish. I just followed orders. He told her everything. The false accusation, cooked up by a powerful rancher who wanted her father's land. The hastily formed posse, full of angry, ignorant men. The chase through the cold pine forests. He told her how they had cornered her father, how Thomas had tried to surrender, to explain, but no one would listen. He raised his hands. He was unarmed, but someone fired, and then everyone fired. I fired too. The confession hung in the cold air, a monstrous, unthinkable truth. Clara stared at him, her mind refusing to process the words. This man, this quiet, gentle, sad man who had saved her sister, was one of them. One of the faceless monsters from her nightmares, who had gunned down her father and left him to die alone in the forest. The kindness he had shown them was not charity. It was the guilt of a killer. The shelter he had given them was not a home. It was a cage built from his own sin. A wave of nausea and betrayal washed over her. She stumbled backwards, her hand flying to the locket at her throat, which now felt like a brand of shame. You killed him.
You did
Abel
this.
didn't deny it. He couldn't. He just stood there and took her words like a final, fatal bullet, his face crumbling into a mask of pure agony. He had confessed his sin to the one person in the world from whom he could never be forgiven. The fragile world they had built together in their shared silence collapsed into dust, leaving them stranded in the ruins of a devastating truth, two enemies living under one roof. The confession shattered their world. The days that followed were filled with a silence colder and heavier than any they had known before. It was a silence of accusation, of grief, and of a betrayal so deep it felt like a physical wound. Clara and Rose moved through the cabin like ghosts, their faces pale and drawn. They ate Abel's food because they had to, but every bite felt like poison. They slept under his roof, but every creak of the floorboards sounded like the footsteps of a monster. Clara, in particular, was torn apart. Half of her screamed to run, to flee this house of ghosts and never look back. But the other half, the pragmatic half that had kept them alive for so long, knew the truth. It was the dead of winter. They had no money, no food, and nowhere to go. To leave was to choose a slow, certain death in the snow over a life under the roof of their father's killer. It was an impossible choice. Abel, for his part, accepted their hatred as his due. He did not approach them. He did not speak to them unless absolutely necessary. He simply continued his penance, working until his muscles screamed and his hands were raw, leaving food and firewood for them like offerings at a tomb. He was their jailer, and he was their prisoner. He had confessed, and now he was serving his sentence, waiting for them to deliver their final verdict. The verdict, however, would be forced upon them not by their own will, but by the arrival of another ghost from their past. A horse and buggy appeared on the horizon one morning, a dark speck that grew steadily larger. As it pulled up to the ranch, Clara felt a cold dread that surpassed even her hatred for Abel. It was their uncle, Mr. Finch, a man whose cruelty was born not of a guilty conscience, but of a cold, empty heart. He was a thin, weaselly man with greedy eyes that darted around, assessing the value of the ranch. He had heard rumors in the settlement, rumors of his two runaway nieces living with the reclusive rancher, Abel. Seeing an opportunity, he had come to reclaim his property. Clara, Rose, my dear girls, I was so worried. It's time to come home. I found a position for you both. A fine opportunity at the mining camp laundry. Hard work, but it will build character. Clara knew what that meant. It wasn't a job. It was indentured servitude. He was going to sell them to the mining company to pay off his own gambling debts. She looked at his smug, cruel face and realized a terrible truth. Abel had taken her father's life in a moment of weakness and ignorance. This man, Mr. Finch, would knowingly, deliberately, and happily take their entire future for a handful of silver. Abel came out of the barn, his face grim. He stood silently, watching the scene unfold. Finch sneered at him. "Stay out of this, hermit. These are my blood, my responsibility. They're coming with me." Finch reached out a grasping hand to grab Rose's arm. And in that moment, Clara had to make her choice. It was a choice between two monsters. The monster who had killed her father but had shown her a broken, remorseful humanity, or the monster who shared her blood but possessed no humanity at all. Her decision was instant and absolute. As Finch lunged for her sister, Clara moved, but she didn't run towards Finch. She ran back, placing herself firmly behind the solid, unmoving form of Abel. It was a shocking, decisive act. A silent declaration she had chosen her side. Rose, seeing her sisters move, scrambled to stand behind Abel as well. The two orphaned daughters of Thomas stood behind one of their father's killers, seeking his protection. Abel looked down at the two small figures huddled behind him, then looked up at the sneering face of Mr. Finch. The choice had been made for him. He was no longer just a penitent. He was a protector. A fragile, broken, and impossible alliance had just been forged in the face of a common enemy. Seeing the two girls take refuge behind Abel, Mr. Finch's face twisted into a mask of pure, greedy rage. He saw his investment slipping through his fingers. He lunged forward, intending to drag them out by force, but he was met by a wall of silent, unyielding resolve. Abel did not move, but his presence, his sheer size, and the sudden, dangerous fire in his eyes was enough to make Finch stop in his tracks. For the first time, Finch saw not a sad, broken hermit, but a man with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. But Abel knew this couldn't be won with fists. Finch had the law, however twisted, on his side. So Abel fought him with the only weapon he had left, the very guilt that had been his prison. He strode into his cabin, returning a moment later with a small, heavy leather pouch. He threw it on the ground at Finch's feet. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. "You want to sell them? Fine. Sell them to me." He walked back inside, emerging again with a dusty ledger book and a pen. He laid them on a tree stump, a makeshift table between the two men. It was the account of his ranch, 15 years of lonely, profitable work. Money he had hoarded but never spent. Money that had felt dirty, tainted by the blood of the man who should have been earning it himself. "Name your price. I'll pay you whatever the mining company offered. Double it. You'll sign a legal document, here and now, relinquishing all guardianship. You will walk away from this ranch, and you will never see them again." Finch's greedy eyes lit up. He saw the years of accumulated profit in the ledger. This was far more than he could have hoped for. He quickly named a ridiculously high price. Abel didn't even flinch. He just nodded, his face like stone, and wrote out the bill of sale. He was using the wages of his sin to buy their freedom. He was paying the debt he owed their father, not with apologies, but with cold, hard cash, the only language a man like Finch could understand. The deal was done. Finch snatched the pouch of gold, signed the paper with a flourish, and left without a backward glance, leaving the two sisters standing free, but forever bound to the man who had just bought them. Spring came to the ranch, not with a sudden burst, but slowly, tentatively, like a fragile hope. The heavy silence in the cabin was still there, but it was different now. It was no longer the silence of accusation, but the quiet of healing. They still rarely spoke of the past, but they no longer had to. It was a known, shared landscape they navigated together. The true change was outside. The epilogue of their story was written not in words, but in the earth itself. One morning, Abel had hitched his plow to his strongest horse and had driven it into the heart of the fallow field, the weed-choked patch of land that had mirrored his own stagnant soul for so long. He worked for days, turning over the hard, unforgiving soil. And this time, he was not alone. Clara and Rose were there beside him. They didn't help with the plow, but they followed behind, their small hands clearing stones, pulling stubborn roots, preparing the earth for new life. The three of them, the remorseful killer and the daughters of the man he killed, worked together under the vast, open sky, planting seeds of corn and squash in the newly turned earth. They were planting a future. On the porch of the cabin, the small, broken music box sat on the railing. It was fixed now, its delicate melody of a bluebird in flight occasionally carried on the spring breeze. Abel knew he could never be truly forgiven. His sin was a part of him, a scar on his soul that would never fade. But as he looked at the two young women working beside him, their faces turned towards the sun, he understood that redemption was not about erasing the past. It was about building a future worthy of the life that was lost. He had not given them back their father, but he was giving them the home, the safety, and the future their father would have died to provide. And for this broken, impossible family, forged in tragedy and bound by a shared ghost, it was, finally, a beginning.